In the late 11th century, the Byzantine Empire called upon their brothers of Latin Christendom to aid in reclaiming lost Christian territory in the Middle East. For Pope Urban II, this call for help couldn't have come at a better time. His predecessor, Gregory VII, had spent much of his papacy trying to work out the details of Christian holy war. For in the Islamic faith, the idea of jihad was a core component. Thus, Muslim rulers had no qualms fighting enemies on the grounds of religion. Christianity, on the other hand, had no ingrained notion of sacred war, and the recent popes had been developing this idea in Europe. Gregory made much progress, but died before he could implement his goals. Urban II fought a different struggle, as he tried to assert his authority over the secular leaders of Western Europe. He saw this call for aid from the Greeks as an opportunity not only to expand and consolidate his papal authority, but to formalize the notion of Christian holy war. The First Crusade, as it would be called, was by far the most successful of all 8 crusades. One of the main reasons for its success was the fact that the Christians were fighting a divided enemy. During and after Muhammad's life, the caliphate spread rapidly, eventually extending from Gibraltar to the Persian Gulf. This didn't last long, however, as the Moors in Iberia broke away in 700 AD. 2 centuries later, the Shia Fatimid Caliphate formed in North Africa and Egypt, rejecting the Sultan of Baghdad's authority. Not only were these divided Muslim states unable or unwilling to unite against the Crusaders, but sometimes they would even ally with them, thus dispelling the notion that the Crusades were a simple conflict pitting Christians against Muslims. Adding to the nuance of this era was the fact that Palestine often acted more as a border zone between Islam and Christendom, rather than consolidated Muslim territory. This was because the region changed hands between Latin Christendom, the Byzantine Empire, and the Caliphates often over the past few centuries. After the Byzantine Emperor called for help to drive back the Anatolian Muslims, the Pope went across Western Europe, famously preaching the sermon at Clermont to a gathering of clergy and nobles. Soon after, an army of approximately 75,000 men, women, and children set off towards Constantinople. This army was led by 5 princes: Baldwin, Raymond, Godfrey, Bohemond, and Tancred. Thus, the First Crusade earned its moniker, the Princes' Crusade. When each prince went through Constantinople, Alexius coerced them into swearing oaths of loyalty before going on campaign. After they agreed, he doled out lavish rewards, with one prince earning an entire room packed with gold. The timing of this campaign seemed propitious. Khalil Arslan, the Seljuk Turkish Sultan, had crushed the so-called People's Crusade a few months prior. Therefore, he assumed that this next army would be no more of a threat, and thus left to the east to deal with a minor territorial dispute. This mistake allowed the Crusaders to cross the Hellespont and establish a beachhead without being challenged. The Crusaders' first target was obvious. The Greek city of Nicaea was rich in church history and had recently been lost to the Muslims. At first, it wasn't clear as to how the Crusaders should go about taking the city. It was guarded by fearsome fortifications, but worse, the western part of the city was against the Ascanian Lake, meaning that even if the city was besieged, it could still be supplied by water. Khalil Arslan eventually realized the danger that his capital city was in, and planned to ambush the Crusaders. However, his plan was foiled when a captured Turkish spy gave up the plans of the attack to his Frankish captors. Thus, the Crusaders were able to push the Turks back when they charged, and worked on besieging the city. They experienced little success, but fortunately the Byzantines came to their aid. They hauled a flotilla of ships overland to the lake and sailed to the city's western wall. At the same time, the Crusaders on land launched an assault. The besieged were in a state of panic, and quickly surrendered. The city was handed to Alexius, much to the chagrin of many Crusaders. They would, however, receive great amounts of gold in reward. The Crusaders marked Antioch as their next target. The Crusaders established a council of princes with which to command the armies as they set out across Anatolia. It was certain that this journey would be a difficult one, but it was for that very reason that so many volunteered. For it was believed that a pilgrimage full of hardship would purge the soul of sin and allow one to gain a place in heaven. Contrary to popular belief, it is evident that the vast majority were making this pilgrimage for spiritual reasons, rather than a desire for wealth. The expense of paying for a mount, weapons, and armor was great enough to make many rather apprehensive of this journey. Thus, any first crusader was likely to have spiritual motivations for doing so. The army split in two and set out across Anatolia. On the first day of July, 1097, the Turks ambushed the leading army near Dorylaeum. One member of this army recalled the horror, saying, "The Saracens all suddenly came into sight and began at once to howl and gabble and shout, saying with loud voices in their own language some devilish word I do not understand, screaming like demons." Miraculously, the Crusaders were able to form a line and hold their ground while they waited for help to arrive. They boosted their morale by passing an uplifting message down the line. "Stand fast together, trusting in Christ and the victory of the Holy Cross. Today may we all gain much treasure." Eventually, the main crusading force arrived and the Turks were forced to retreat. As the Franks crossed Asia Minor, their ranks were plagued by pestilence, disease, and hunger. Once they arrived in the fertile southeastern corner of Asia Minor, they started to ally with the Armenian Christians who had previously lived under Turkish rule. Baldwin would head east to establish his own dominion, and eventually became ruler of the First Crusader state, the county of Edessa. Meanwhile, the crusading armies prepared to confront a most foreboding foe, the city of Antioch. The Council of Princes needed to make a decision. Were they to attempt to storm the city's mighty fortifications, or were they to somehow besiege the city? Neither option was suitable. Instead, they decided upon a partial blockade, sending armies to guard the Gate of the Duke, the Dog Gate, and the St. Paul Gate. The Crusaders made certain to cultivate maritime contacts to ensure naval aid, and strengthen their system of logistics. Over time, they were able to guard the two southern entrances, but the Iron Gate to the east still remained out of their reach. This remained a crucial lifeline for the nearly encircled Muslims. The brutal reality of medieval siege warfare took its toll on both the besieged and the besiegers. Both sides committed heinous acts to terrify and enrage their foe. Beheadings and other brutal forms of abuse were commonplace. As spring arrived, the Crusaders strengthened their hold on the bridge gate to the south. With no end to the siege in sight, the Crusaders received terrible news. The mighty general Kerboga of Mosul had amassed a force with which to relieve his allies at Antioch. It was vital that the Crusaders take the city before his massive force arrived. Bohemund then proclaimed that whoever was able to engineer Antioch's fall would gain control of the city. Of course, he did this because he had perfect reason to believe that he could engineer the downfall of Antioch. He had made contact with the traitor. Firuz was a tower commander who had made contact with the Crusaders, offering to help them. On the night of June 2nd, a group of Bohemund's men climbed a ladder to the post where Firuz was waiting. After stealthily dispatching a few other tower guards, the Crusaders sounded bugles and shouted their battle cry. The garrison in the city was shocked, and the Crusaders poured in, slaughtering the citizens indiscriminately. The governor of Antioch fled, only to be captured and beheaded by a local peasant. After this merciless slaughter, the Crusaders found themselves in a dire situation. Kerboga's army had arrived and surrounded the city of Antioch. The besiegers had become the besieged. The Crusaders held on to the hope that a Byzantine army would arrive, but this was betrayed when Stephen of Bluoff fled the city, came across Emperor Alexius in central Anatolia, and told him that the Crusaders had already been defeated. Alexius thus returned to Constantinople. The most intense fighting of the entire crusade ensued, with brutal combat literally lasting from dawn to dusk. On the night of June 13th, the Crusaders reported seeing a shooting star crashing into the Muslim camp. The very next day, Kerboga had his men retreat from Mount Silpius. This was likely done for strategic reasons. Kerboga was unable to break the Crusaders with intense fighting, so he focused on completely encircling Antioch. Large brigades blocked the Bridge Gate and the St. George Gate. The Crusaders suffered the worst starvation and disease of the entire crusade. On the 14th of June, however, a self-styled prophet by the name of Peter Bartholomew was digging in the Basilica of St. Peter. There he found a small metal shard, which he claimed was from the lance that pierced the side of Christ on the cross. This discovery certainly bolstered the morale of the Crusaders, but it was certainly not a turning point in the fortunes of the First Crusade. It would be another fortnight before they attempted to seek battle again. After seeking a peace with Kerboga and being sternly declined, they realized that their only hope was a final attack. On the 28th of June, Bohemund led an army out of the Bridge Gate and across the river Orontes. Kerboga was far to the north, and decided to wait for the Crusaders to form up outside of the city to destroy them en masse. But just when he needed to keep a cool head, he foundered, and hurriedly sent forces to confront Bohemund. His timing was appalling. The Muslims outside of the Bridge Gate panicked when they couldn't hold back the Latins, and fled straight into the ranks of their comrades, causing chaos. Kerboga was humiliated, and fled with his men. The second siege of Antioch was a disaster for Islam. The crusade was then stalled for nearly a year as the Latin princes vied for control of the city. Eventually, civil unrest broke out and Raymond was forced to give up his claims. The Latins had gained a reputation for monstrous brutality, which aided them on their path toward Jerusalem, as many Muslim governors of Palestinian cities were willing to sign truces for fear of destruction if they denied. The Crusaders traced the Mediterranean coastline, turning inland at Arsuf and nearing ever closer to the Holy City. Alas, on June 7th of 1099, Jerusalem came into view. Raymond set up his forces on Mount Zion, and Godfrey did so near the Damascus Gate. This splitting up of the army resulted from the ever-present discord in the Crusader armies, but it did provide a tactical advantage, exposing Jerusalem to an attack on two fronts. The Christians were now deep inside enemy territory, facing one of the most fortified and revered cities in the world. The task ahead seemed almost insurmountable. After an initial failed assault, the princes decided to postpone any further attacks until the necessary siege weaponry could be constructed. They then encountered a new enemy. Instead of hunger, they were suffering from severe thirst as the Palestinian summer heat exhausted the soldiers and all of the nearby waterholes were polluted. Thankfully, an unexpected blessing came from a Genoese fleet which brought along with it the supplies and crews needed to build siege weaponry. As per usual, both sides exchanged acts of barbarism to enrage and humiliate their foes. As at Antioch, dreadful news of an enemy relief force arrived at the Crusader camp. The Crusaders underwent 3 days of spiritual cleansing, with masses, public confessions, and sermons. During this time, they were pursuing a rapid buildup of heavy siege weaponry, preparing for their final assault on the Holy City. At sunrise on the 14th of July, the Crusaders sounded bugles to signal the call to war on both fronts. The Muslims in the north peered over the parapet and were shocked at what they saw. Godfrey had a siege engine built which could be rapidly broken down into different sections and then reassembled in short order. He had it built near the quadrangular tower, but under the cover of the night, had moved it almost a mile east to threaten a weak section of the wall. Eventually, with this weapon and a large battering ram, the Franks were able to break through the first line of defense to the north. The Muslim governor of Jerusalem believed the main attack would come from Mount Zion, and he was able to push back attacks by concentrating his forces here. The next day, the Franks to the north were able to inch ever closer to the main battlements, and eventually broke the main wall. The Crusaders poured into the city, while the Muslims defending it fled. In fact, the Franks to the south had been on the brink of defeat, but when the northern wall fell, the Muslims in the south deserted their positions, and Raymond had his troops rush in to join with the other army. After 4 years of exhausting marches and intense fighting, the Crusaders had finally achieved their dream by conquering the most prestigious city in the world. Though they wasted no time in brutally pillaging it. For at least 2 days they slaughtered the inhabitants of the city, leaving the streets littered with corpses baking in the heat of the Palestinian summer. These acts of barbarism were concluded with the Crusaders going to the Holy Sepulchre and thanking God for their conquest. The First Crusade thus ended, with the Christians' costly triumph in Palestine and the establishment of the Crusader states. There would, of course, be 8 more Crusades over the next few centuries, but this first war for the Holy Land was the one that both sides looked back to, the Christians in gratitude, and the Muslims in anger.